In 1946, Superman took down a gang of robed, hooded white supremacists. He did it over 16 episodes of The Adventures of Superman, America's most popular radio show at the time. The plot went something like this. A Chinese-American family moves to Metropolis. The Clan of the Fiery Cross, fictional stand-ins for the real-life Ku Klux Klan, burns a tall wooden cross on the family's lawn. Superman leaps to the family's defense. When I first heard about it, I thought, a Chinese-American family. Neat. I've watched and read Superman stories since I was little. I wasn't used to finding characters in them who looked like me. In January of 1865, when the bloody Civil War was nearing its end, the federal government of the United States passed the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery except as a way to punish crime. Later that same year, a group of men gathered together in Tennessee for the first meeting of the Ku Klux Klan. These men believed in white supremacy, the idea that people from Western and Northern Europe are just plain better than all other kinds of people. They feared that the newly freed black slaves would ask for equal rights and equal treatment. The Klan terrorized African Americans and their white allies not just in Tennessee, but all across the South. They issued threats, burned down churches, and murdered countless people. I can't remember when I first discovered Superman. Was it the classic 1978 movie starring Christopher Reeve? Or the old Super Friends cartoon? Or perhaps the Superman puzzle book I bought at a school book fair in the first grade? I don't know for sure. He seems to have always been there. I liked his powers, of course, but I loved his costume. The emblem on his chest looked like a badge, or maybe a shield. It told everyone that he was Superman, and that was awesome. In 1865, white supremacists in California read newspaper articles about the Ku Klux Klan in the South. They felt inspired. Few African Americans lived on the West Coast, but plenty of Chinese did. People who looked like me began coming to America in large numbers at the beginning of the 1800s. By the time the Civil War ended, Chinese made up 10% of California's population, and more were coming. The federal government was already making noise about granting African Americans the right to vote. If they did the same for the Chinese immigrants, what would become of white supremacy in the West? In 1868, a missive appeared in the San Francisco Bay Area calling the Ku Klux Klan to action, action, action. Soon after, Klansmen started terrorizing Chinese immigrants and their white allies, not just in California, but up and down the West Coast. They issued threats, burned down churches, and murdered countless people. The terrorism in the West was never as widespread nor as organized as the terrorism in the South, but it was still terrifying. The largest mass lynching in California's history happened in Los Angeles Chinatown in 1871. A mob rampaged through a Chinatown street, known as Negro Alley. Although the mob did not explicitly claim to be the Klan, they definitely acted Klan-like. They hanged to death between 17 and 20 Chinese men and boys. I've never had a run-in with the Ku Klux Klan. The racism I encountered as a kid wasn't nearly as dramatic as a fiery cross. It was quiet and subtle. In the 7th grade, I wrote a story about Cobra Commander's death. Cobra Commander is the archenemy of G.I. Joe, a team of superhero soldiers who ruled after-school cartoons in the 1980s. Mr. Stevens, my teacher, liked my story so much that he read it to the whole class. He ended in his most ominous voice. As Cobra Commander breathed his last, he hissed, "G.I. Joe has won." The other students clapped. I tried to keep my smile as humble as possible. "G.I. Joe," one of my classmates said to me. "Cool story. We'll call him Danny." Danny was broad-shouldered, hazel-eyed, and athletic. He wore clothes that you saw on billboards, and he never tied his shoes, which everybody thought was awesome. He gave me a thumbs up. My smile stopped being humble. Later in PE, I saw Danny standing on the soccer field. He'd actually talk to me, I thought. I ought to return the favor. I walked up to him. "Hey, Danny," I said. "Hey," he said. "G.I. Joe, cool story, man. High five. He put his hand up. As soon as I reached for it, he pulled back. I'm not touching, no. Then Danny said a word that rhymes with stink. I watched his shoelace drag across the grass as he walked away. After the Civil War, white supremacist politicians in the South began enacting black codes, laws that made sure African Americans would remain second-class citizens. Although the 15th Amendment granted African American men the right to vote, the code kept them out of the voting booth. They also kept them out of white neighborhoods, schools, churches, and even restrooms. The codes became popularly known as the Jim Crow laws. White supremacists in the West came up with an even more clever tactic. They saw that the federal government no longer tolerated slavery, so they began to argue that the Chinese immigrants were actually slaves. They pointed out that Chinese worked in terrible, slave-like conditions. If America really wanted to get rid of slavery, they said, the country had to close its border to the Chinese. Their argument was ridiculous. Chinese immigrants did live unquestionably difficult lives. They were often the victims of brutal, unfair contracts. They couldn't fight back because their testimony wasn't recognized in American courts. But as bad as things were, they weren't slaves. Nobody could sell off their loved ones at a moment's notice. Even so, the tactic worked. In 1882, America passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, effectively ending all legal immigration from China to the United States. By the end of the 1800s, with Jim Crow laws and the Chinese Exclusion Act in place, the Ku Klux Klan no longer felt threatened by African Americans in the South or Chinese immigrants in the West. People stopped joining, and their membership shrank. Shortly after the incident with Danny, I started pestering my mom to take me to a local mall. One Saturday, she finally did. I made a beeline for a store called Aka Joe. It sold clothes you saw on billboards. I picked out a bright white sweatshirt with the store's logo on the chest, letter ACA stenciled in an oval. It looked like a badge, or maybe a shield. I silently hoped that it would protect me from that word that rhymes with stink. It did not. In 1915, a movie called The Birth of a Nation opened in theaters all across America. It portrays the Ku Klux Klan as a team of white supremacist heroes who hide their identities underneath robes and hoods while defending the country against the threat of the newly freed slaves. In one scene, Klansmen burn a cross, a fiery symbol of their hatred. The real-life Klan had never done this before. The movie was a hit. Audiences flocked to see it. Companies sold Klan-themed merchandise like hats and aprons. Fans hosted Klan-themed parties and invited their friends to come dressed up as Klansmen. The Birth of a Nation made between $50 and $100 million, making it the first ever blockbuster movie. Even President Woodrow Wilson was a fan. After watching the film at a special screening at the White House, he described it admiringly as writing history with lightning. Within a few months, the Ku Klux Klan was back in business, and this time, they were a business. They hired a publicity agent to help them make as much money as possible. One of their strategies was to expand their circle of hate to include more kinds of people. The new Klan didn't just hate African Americans and Chinese immigrants. They also hated the Mexicans, Middle Easterners, Japanese, and Filipinos, as well as Roman Catholics and Jews from Eastern and Southern Europe. Although they continued the Klan traditions of violence, the second Klan started hosting family-friendly events like picnics and parades to attract new members. Taking a cue from the movie, they burned tall wooden crosses at their events. The second Ku Klux Klan was a hit. At its peak, it had several million dues-paying members. Superman first appeared in 1938, in the very first issue of a comic book series called Action Comics. The hero was very different from how he is now. The S emblem on his chest hadn't yet evolved into its familiar diamond shape. He worked at a newspaper called the Daily Star, not the Daily Planet. Lois Lane was in the office, but Jimmy Olsen and Perry White were nowhere to be seen. His powers were different too. He was super strong and super fast. but he couldn't fly. He could only leap. He couldn't shoot heat rays out of his eyes or blow freeze breath from his mouth either. Those would come later. Superman was created by two teenagers in Cleveland, Ohio, named Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. They were both sons of Jewish immigrants. As white supremacist ideas grew stronger and stronger in Europe, hatred for Jews grew worse and worse. Jerry and Joe's families worried that things would turn violent, so they escaped to America. To fit it better, both families changed their last names. The Siegels were originally the Siegeloviches, and the Schusters were the Schusterowiches. Unfortunately, the name change did not protect them from hate. When Jerry and Joe were growing up in Cleveland, it wasn't uncommon for job ads in the local newspaper to say, "No Jews need apply." Often Jews would only find work in the roughest parts of town. Jerry's dad ran a second-hand clothing store in such a neighborhood. When Jerry was 17 years old, someone tried to rob the store, and Jerry's dad suffered a heart attack and died. Jerry and his friend Joe loved stories about aliens, spacemen, and other planets. They loved them so much that they created their own fanzine called Science Fiction. In the third issue of Science Fiction, published in 1933, Jerry and Joe wrote and drew a story titled The Reign of the Superman, about a man who gets mind control powers, turns evil, tries to destroy the world by spreading hateful thoughts. In the end, a do-gooder reporter confronts this evil Superman to save the day. In the 5 years between Science Fiction number 3 and Action Comics number 1, Jerry and Joe came up with several game-changing ideas. First, they decided to make Superman good. Instead of having mind control powers like a mad scientist, they made him strong and fast, like a pulp magazine hero. Second, they dressed him up like a circus strongman. Circuses were popular back then. Performers wore colorful, skin-tight costumes so that the audience member in the back row could still see them. Finally, Jerry and Joe made Superman an alien from another planet. He would be an immigrant, like their parents. He would hide his identity underneath a red tie, a white shirt, a blue jacket, and a pair of glasses. He even had another name to fit it better: Clark Kent. Superman was a hit. Readers flocked to buy his comics. Demand for Superman merchandise was so intense that his publisher had to set up Superman Inc., a subsidiary dedicated to licensing the hero's likeness. Soon, kids all across America were playing with Superman paper dolls, puzzles, and paint sets. Then, on Monday, February 12, 1940, Superman made his way to radio, America's most popular medium at the time. It was on the radio that Superman would make one of his most important contributions to America. By the end of the 1930s, war had broken out in Europe and Asia. Jerry and Joe's parents' worst nightmares had come true. German white supremacists called Nazis began to systemically arrest and murder the Jews in their country. At first, America tried to stay neutral. Then, on December 7th, 1941, the Empire of Japan, an ally of Nazi Germany, attacked an American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Honolulu, Hawaii. More than 2,000 Americans were killed. Japan, Germany, and Italy had formed an alliance known as the Axis. Within days, President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared a war on all three Axis powers. America had officially entered World War II. Back then, the United States Army observed Jim Crow by separating American soldiers into regiments by race. The Army's non-white regiments were not as well equipped nor as well supported as the white regiments. Non-white soldiers were often passed over for promotions to leadership positions. This hypocrisy infuriated many Americans. In January of 1942, a young African American named James G. Thompson wrote a letter to the Pittsburgh Courier. In it, he expresses how much he wants to serve his country and help America defeat the forces of evil. But he also asks, should I sacrifice my life to live half American? He ends his letter by challenging America to fight for 2 victories: a fight against the Axis powers abroad, and a victory against equality at home. A double victory. African Americans enlisted in record numbers, far more than for the First World War. Other non-white Americans did too. They fought in the hopes of James G. Thompson's double victory. The attack on Pearl Harbor changed things for Chinese Americans in an unexpected way. Almost overnight, our public image flipped. DC Comics, the publisher of this graphic novel, is named after Detective Comics, the company's longest-running title. That's what the letters DC stands for, Detective Comics. The first issue of Detective Comics came out in 1937, 4 years before America entered the war. The cover shows a drawing of a Chinese villain with slanted demonic eyes and an evil frown. Before Pearl Harbor, this was how many Americans thought of the Chinese: sneaky, criminal, and threatening. If you wanted to buy something illegal, you would go to the neighborhood where all the Chinese people lived. After Pearl Harbor, America realized that China was its greatest ally against Japan. Suddenly, Chinese Americans weren't sneaky, criminal, and threatening anymore. We became hardworking, loyal, and brave. Unlike African American and Japanese American soldiers, some Chinese American soldiers were even allowed to integrate into white regiments. On December 21st, 1941, Time magazine published an issue about Pearl Harbor. The cover shows a drawing of Yamamoto Isoroku, the Japanese admiral who had masterminded the attack. The artist drew Admiral Yamamoto with slanted demonic eyes and an evil frown. These stereotypes that were once applied to the Chinese had been refocused solely on the Japanese. That same issue of Time has an article titled, "How to Tell Our Friends from the Japs." It lists instructions to figure out if a person is Chinese or Japanese. After decades of being villains, the Chinese in America were now friends. In December of 1942, an executive order signed by President Roosevelt forced Japanese Americans out of their home and into internment camps until the war ended. It seemed like a reasonable strategy for dealing with a sneaky, criminal, and threatening population. People of German and Italian descent were also interned, albeit on a much smaller scale, though the vast majority were not citizens. 62% of the internees in the Japanese camps were citizens of the United States. The Adventures of Superman radio show starred Clayton Bud Collier, one of the most in-demand voice actors of the 1930s and 40s. With his tall frame and thin mustache, he didn't look much like Clark Kent, but because of his uncanny ability to switch from nerdy newspaper reporter to superhero, Collier became the first actor to ever play Superman. The show was a hit. After just 2 months of episodes, it topped the charts as the highest-rated kids program in America. Millions of listeners tuned in 3 times a week, and their hunger for stories encouraged the writers to quickly develop their hero and his world. The show introduced many important pieces of the Superman mythos, including the Daily Planet, Perry White, and Kryptonite. Even Superman's powers evolved. He switched from leaping to flying for the first time on his radio show. During World War II, Superman faced off against Nazi villains like Der Teufel, the Scarlet Widow, and the Atom Man. Superman spent the war years fighting hate. On May 8th, 1945, Nazi Germany surrendered. Japan surrendered 3 months later on September 2nd. America and our allies had won. The year before, on June 22nd, 1944, President Roosevelt had signed the GI Bill into law. The bill offered the men and women who had served so valiantly in World War II a number of benefits, including money for college and loans to buy homes and start businesses. Veterans returned home full of hope. This was especially true of non-white veterans, since the GI Bill did not contain any language that excluded them because of their race. After years of sacrifice, the double victory seemed to finally be within reach. By this time, The Adventures of Superman was more popular than ever, with 4 million listeners per episode, but it needed a new direction. Now that the Nazis had been defeated in real life, Superman couldn't keep fighting them in fiction. But who was a threat to peace in post-war America? Not everyone looked forward to the possibility of a double victory. On the evening of May 9th, 1946, a doctor named Samuel Green led a group of men up Stone Mountain near Atlanta, Georgia. Green was a Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan. As Grand Dragon, Green had watched the Second Klan collapse before the war. Many Klansmen left once they realized the entire operation was just a money-making scheme. Others left after the leader's criminal behavior came to light. One Klan leader had been convicted of murdering his secretary. Another was in prison for murdering a rival. Still, others arrested for bribery and theft. Samuel Green longed for a Klan revival. That night on Stone Mountain, he and his followers built a tall wooden cross and set it on fire. They announced a brand new era of hate. As Green had hoped, newspapers all over the nation covered the ceremony. Life magazine even published a 3-page photo spread. Although the text called the Klansmen bigots, the gorgeously shot photos showed well-dressed, clean-cut men gathered around a fiery cross that shone brightly across the dark sky. The Ku Klux Klan was about to get back on its feet. The Klan's original revival had been inspired by a movie about men in white robes. Its next revival would be stifled by a radio show about a man in a red cape. No one is sure who came up with the idea. Stetson Kennedy, an intrepid anti-Klan reporter, said he had brought the idea to the radio show's staff. Kenyon and Eckert, an advertising agency that worked with the show, said the idea was actually theirs. Bob Maxwell, the head of Superman Inc., claimed he had to convince Kenyon and Eckert to get on board. He certainly had reason for wanting his company's premier superhero to take on the Klan. As a Jewish American, Maxwell recoiled in horrors when he read about what white supremacists had done to Jewish people in Europe. He felt a duty to fight bigotry however he could. To avoid getting sued by an organization that was legally recognized by several states, the show's writers created a stand-in organization called the Klan of the Fiery Cross. There was no mistaking their intentions, though. The fictional villains had the same costumes, rituals, and beliefs as the real-life Ku Klux Klan. Maxwell read through 25 different scripts before landing on the right one. There was plenty of risks, so he wanted to be careful. What if the story was too preachy? Or too scary? Superman might alienate his young fans. Even worse, what if a listener only tuned into a part of an episode and left with the impression that Superman actually condoned bigotry? The script had to get things just right. On June 10th, 1946, the episode of the 16-part Klan of the Fiery Cross storyline aired. For the next several weeks, listeners all across America huddled around their radio to listen as young Tommy Lee, his father, Dr. Lee, and his unnamed mother and sister moved into Metropolis and ran afoul of a group of violent bigots. They cheered when Superman leapt to the family's defense. The storyline had its detractors. Klan supporters in Atlanta called for a boycott of the show's sponsors. Bob Maxwell even received death threats from the New Jersey Klan. Most people, though, loved it. The Adventures of Superman received awards from the United Parents Association and the Boys Club of America. Newsweek magazine called it the first children's program to develop a social consciousness. Listenership soared. Some believe that Superman's radio defeat of the Klan of the Fiery Cross led to the real-life Klan's public image downfall. After being portrayed as bumbling, hateful rubes on a children's show, the Ku Klux Klan would never again command the same level of respect it had once enjoyed. After World War II, many Chinese American veterans did what the Lee family did in the Klan of the Fiery Cross. With help from the GI Bill, they moved out of the nation's Chinatowns and into the suburbs. They were often met with hostility. Once they got to their new neighborhoods, some were threatened. Others had garbage thrown on their lawns. Some chose to move in the middle of the night to avoid trouble. Even so, in part because of the public image shift that had happened after Pearl Harbor, Chinese Americans were able to make the move. Not all non-white Americans were as lucky. Black veterans had a much harder time accessing the GI Bill's benefits, despite the bill not having any language about race. In the South, where most African Americans lived, the federal government handed over the bill's administration to racist local officials. Many black veterans were denied the home loans that they had rightfully earned, so they were unable to make the same move the Chinese Americans had. Japanese Americans also faced hardships. Even after they were released from internment camps, most could not recover the homes and businesses that had been taken from them. Their own government had erased their pre war lives. The Klan of the Fiery Cross is made up of intolerant bigots, Clark Kent tells Jimmy Olsen in the Klan's Storyline's third episode. They don't judge a man in the decent American way by his own qualities. They judge him by what church he goes to and by the color of his skin. Intolerance is a filthy weed, he continues. The only way to get rid of it is by hunting out the roots and pulling them out of the ground. Superman was leading us to a bright new tomorrow. Unfortunately, post-war America didn't follow him all the way. We left the double victory incomplete. My mother was born in China in 1945, a year before the end of World War II. During the first years of her life, her family moved from one city to the next, trying their best to escape violence and starvation. They eventually made it to Hong Kong and then Taiwan. After graduating from a Taiwanese college, my mother came to the United States. She met my father, who had also come from Taiwan. The two of them went on to earn master's degrees, despite not having completely mastered English. They courageously faced down racism and other indignities and went on to build a life for themselves and their family. My parents were able to achieve all they have, not only because they worked hard, and believe me, they worked hard, but also because they immigrated over 2 decades after the Lees first moved to Metropolis, to an America that had not given up the struggle for a true double victory. We are still in the midst of that struggle. After my father arrived in America, and before he met my mom, he was terribly lonely. He lived in a boarding house with other students. One of them was named Dave. Dave had dark brown hair and Clark Kent glasses. He'd grown up in a town that was driving distance from campus. Dave must have sensed that my father needed a friend. Despite the language barrier, Dave began talking with my father. First, one conversation, then another. On holidays, when the house cleared out, Dave invited my father to go with him to his parents' home. Dave's parents and siblings welcomed my father with open arms, and they shared many meals together. I felt a lot less lonesome during the holidays, my father says. I'm grateful for that warm friendship. 50 years have passed. My father and Dave each found wives, raised families, started and then ended careers. They are friends to this day. When I think about what the future ought to be like, I don't think about my junior high classmate with the untied shoes. I think about the friendship between my dad and Dave. Superman is one of our nation's and the world's most enduring icons. He seems to have always been there, and he's not going away anytime soon. Ever since defending a Chinese American family in 1946, he stood for tolerance, justice, and hope. Even today, the immigrant from Krypton challenges us to follow his example more fully and more perfectly. We have to meet his challenge. After all, though our yesterdays may be difficult, we all share the same tomorrow. When I was in high school, I didn't care for the character of Superman one bit. I thought he was corny. I thought he was lame. And I thought he was an overpowered character who made no sense to be a goody two-shoes he was, with all the powers he possessed. That's right. At one point you could say I honestly hated Superman. Now do I have any clue where this unwarranted hate for a fictional character came from? Not really. Heck, as a little kid, I had thought he was cool. He wasn't exactly my cup of tea, but he was cool. He was the good guy. He was just super strong, and he was a part of the Justice League cartoon that I absolutely loved. It wasn't until high school and the rise of evil Superman clones in the media that I started to turn on the big blue Boy Scout. Injustice, Invincible, The Boys. Hell, even Zack Snyder's own DCEU gave us versions of an evil Superman. And just like everyone else in the world, I ate up that concept. However, it wasn't until a couple years ago when that mindset of mine truly started to change. I had been going through my binge of old superhero movies and shows, enjoying things like Super Friends, Batman Brave and the Bold, and the 60s Batman series, when I started to realize my true feelings towards comic characters as a whole was changing. These shows were silly. These shows made characters feel straight out of the golden and silver age of comics. And things didn't have to always be so serious. I realized I like my superheroes to be silly and fun. Heck, I had never cared for the Nolan trilogy. Gotham was too much for me, and Ben Affleck's Batman just wasn't good as Batman. I needed my Adam West. I needed my Batman to be silly and have colorful villains and just not be this dark and serious being. This was the point when I realized if I don't care for a serious Batman, why do I root for the idea of an evil Superman? Why do I root for a Superman who is less of a farm boy and dorky reporter he has always been, and instead root for a Superman who almost acted like a tyrant? So I went on a mission to change my mindset on America's most famous hero. And I have to say, it changed my outlook on not only Superman, but heroes as a whole. Viewing or listening to content like the Christopher Reeve Superman films, Super Friends, Smallville, shout out to my friend Preston with that one, or heck the old Superman cartoon and radio series from the 40s and 50s, might be hard for some people, I'll admit. A lot of the content is silly, unserious, sometimes a little slow, and definitely lacking compared to the big budgets of today. However, there's a charm in that content that you won't find as often in the modern media of today. Charm of wonder, charm of amazement, charm of hope. It's funny that I say hope, because most people know the S on Superman's chest is actually a Kryptonian symbol for hope. However, the Superman of hope we know and love had kind of been missing for a while. I needed to find that Superman of hope. I needed to find something that gave me the real Superman, the big blue Boy Scout in the sky. That's when this book came along. Superman Smashes the Klan by Jean Luen Yang. I was a little late to the party when I first heard about the book, having first heard about it probably in late 2021, 2 years after it had been released. And since then, I have had the book in my wish list for such a long time. It wasn't until visiting my local library recently where I found the book on the shelf and immediately ran to check it out. This was it, my chance at reading a modern story about a Superman who was truly a hero, a Superman who truly fought for justice, a Superman of hope. I'm glad to say, reading this book, I found exactly what I was looking for. Now, Superman Smashes the Klan is a graphic novel based on the 16-part series Clan of the Fiery Cross from the 1940s Superman radio show. It is a rather intense story about young teen Chinese-American siblings Tommy and Roberta Lee, who have just moved into downtown Metropolis from Chinatown as their father has taken up a new job at the Metropolis Health Department. For the most part, the Lee family seems to be welcomed in rather decently, until Tommy ends up beating out fellow teen Chuck Riggs as the pitcher of their community center baseball team. Chuck's uncle, Matthew Riggs, doesn't take very kindly to his nephew losing his spot as star pitcher to the young Chinese American Tommy Lee, and he takes Chuck to a secret meeting. This meeting, of course, is for the Clan of the Fiery Cross, an allegory for the real-life Ku Klux Klan. Through this meeting, Matt Riggs, using his power as the Grand Scorpion, incites hate and violence, trying to influence his nephew as they choose to threaten the Lee family with a burning cross on their front lawn. Luckily, the Lees survive, and even while scared, decide to stay in Metropolis, even with the fear of more to come from the Clan of the Fiery Cross. It's at the same time that the Lee family is dealing with the oncoming battle of hatred and violence that we see Superman himself struggling with his own inner demons. Superman has been holding back. The world sees him as this great man with incredible strength and quick speed, but they still just see him as a man. A Superman, but a man nonetheless. However, there's more to him. He's truly an alien, one with immense powers that he's hiding out of pure fear that the city of Metropolis, and heck, the world as a whole, might turn on him. He's seen the hatred the world gives to those who may be different. What happens if their hero is truly more different than they realize? Throughout the book, we begin to see all our characters experiencing moral dilemmas. Tommy and Roberta Lee just want to fit in. But while Tommy is more willing to act like the rest of the kids at the community center, Roberta is still unsure if she'll truly ever fit in. Chuck battles his thoughts of helping his uncle achieve his goals with the thoughts of doing what's truly right, especially after seeing his hero Superman stand up and save the Lees. Superman himself questions who he really is, and if the world will ever accept his true self as he fights for the justice of people just living their lives as their regular selves. This story is truly a story of self-acceptance and a story of standing up to hatred. Something suited perfectly for the big blue Boy Scout himself. Now, I won't go much more into the plot of the story, as I want to allow each of you to have a chance to read and appreciate it for yourselves. But I will say that in the end, the story truly gave myself a better outlook on not only Superman, but the world as a whole. The Lee family and Superman each struggle with the fear of true acceptance in this hate-filled world. But it is through each of their hopes for a better tomorrow that they come together to take down the Clan of the Fiery Cross. Of course, this comic is based on a radio series during the 40s, a time when the real-life KKK was growing once again, but it still holds power even during the 2020s. While we live in a country that is more accepting and welcoming overall than it has ever been, there are still people who will continue to spew hatred. While the color of our skin, or the God we choose to worship, or the person we love shouldn't matter truly to anyone other than ourselves, as we should have the right to be who we are, all of those topics are sadly talking points that we see the people in power using to manipulate and control all of us. No one is greater than any other person in this world. No one person should have the say over everyone and how they should choose to live their lives. People should not have to live in fear of people choosing what will happen to them. Sadly, this is a truth for many in this country. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that." It's a quote that is sometimes hard to live by, especially when you see those evils in the world and just want to show that same amount of hatred back towards it. It's something our characters in the story struggle with, them wanting to fight back. They want to use their full powers to just end the evil that is torturing them and the town of Metropolis. But they know that if they were, as soon as they did, that evil would use it as an excuse to do more. Our heroes win in the end, not through returning the hate, but through their hope and their desire for a better and equal tomorrow. Superman could have pulled a Homelander, or an Injustice version of himself, and just murdered the whole clan of the Fiery Cross. But it would have made him just hate it even more. Instead, he stood strong on his values. He stood tall in fighting for what was right, and instead of being the figurehead of the ultimate perfect human that the clan and the world wanted to view him as, he fought for justice, equality, and a better future as an outsider himself. It is in Superman's battle for hope and justice that I hope we model our own battles for our future. It is in unity and in hope that we are stronger and can truly change our future for the better. It is through us coming together in love and a passion for a better tomorrow that we can make our voices heard so that we may drive the hatred out. It is in us being super that we will have a better tomorrow. With that, I leave you with the encouragement of fighting for justice, hope, and equality. just as the Big Blue Boy Scout would. Also, read this story if you can. It is a must read for anyone and everyone, especially if you enjoy reading graphic novels. If you're not able to get the comics to read, I highly suggest listening to the radio series, which I will link a YouTube video posted with the whole series in the description below. Lastly, I want to just say that I couldn't have been able to read this book and then be able to make this video if it had not been for my local public library. I encourage all of you to do as I do and support your local library the best you can. And if you haven't visited in a while, go check it out. Thank you to everyone who stayed till the end and has supported me here on this channel. If you enjoy this content, please share it with friends and family, along with letting me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this book. And if there's any topic or book you'd personally like me to cover next. Remember to subscribe, check out the links in the description below, to always stay super. See you next time.